Welcome to the second episode of Food from Fiction. I'm so happy to have made it to the second episode. I thought we would have crashed and burned after the first one, if I'm not gonna lie, but here we are, so miracles happen. Today, before starting to make some food, I wanted to talk about the man who wrote the book behind the inspiration of this video, Roald Dahl. The man who captivated us with so many of his imaginative, far-fetched stories, and he's responsible for so much of our childhood. Mine anyway. And I'm sure I'll make loads more videos about him in the future, because food is such a big theme in his work, so I'm sure I'll come across him again later. But today, I wanted to start with the food I always wanted to try from seeing it in the film. Not only do I think this food ties into one of the best moments of the book and film, but I think it perfectly captures Dahl's essence as a writer, and I think that was very interesting to talk about. I'm going to make the chocolate cake from Matilda. Alright, let's go through all the ingredients and everything you're going to need for making the cake. Let me get the ingredients up. My phone's dead. That's not ideal. For the cake you're going to need 1 3/4 cups of all-purpose flour, or 220 grams, 1 3/4 cups of sugar, or 350 grams, 3/4 cups of unsweetened cocoa powder, or 75 grams. In this bowl, I put in 2 teaspoons of baking soda, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and 1 teaspoon of salt. 1 cup or 240 milliliters of buttermilk. If you don't have that, you can do what I did, which is get 240 milliliters of milk and mix in 1 teaspoon of vinegar or lemon. Half a cup of vegetable oil, or 120 milliliters. 2 large eggs. 2 teaspoons of vanilla. However, you can just eyeball it. I did just eyeball it and just put in a cap's worth, so it's not that important really. And 1 cup or 240 milliliters of hot coffee or hot water, but I would very much suggest putting in hot coffee because it will make the cake taste a lot better. And 200 grams of dark chocolate, that's about 7 ounces. I used 70% dark chocolate and it came out lovely. For the frosting, which is a rich ganache style, you're going to need 300 grams or 10 ounces of dark chocolate, the same dark chocolate that you use for the cake, 240 milliliters of heavy cream. I used whipping cream, but I think it came out okay, so you can use whipping cream if you can't get heavy cream. I also used 200 milliliters rather than 240, and I do think that I could have done with a bit more of the frosting, so I would definitely go more with 240 milliliters if you are going to make it. 115 grams or half a cup of unsalted butter, but I did use lightly salted butter and it actually came out okay and really nice, but I did add extra icing sugar to it, so if you are going to use salted butter, that's something to keep in mind. A pinch of salt if you're not using salted butter. And this is optional, but powdered or icing sugar to make it thicker and sweeter. As for tools, you don't need any specialized tools for this, you just kind of need a whisk and a spatula. First, preheat your oven to 175 degrees Celsius or 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Then you want to get some baking pans and grease them. Ideally, you want to get 2 circular 9-inch pans and separate the batter into those 2 and bake them separately and combine them later. But I didn't have 2 circular 9-inch pans. I only had 1 very small circular pan and it wouldn't do, so I just used a big baking pan. I didn't even measure it, just a big one that I thought would kind of fit all the batter in. So I just used that and greased it with a bit of butter, and that should be okay. Next, you're going to want to mix your dry ingredients. So whisk together your flour, sugar, cocoa, baking soda, baking powder and salt in a big mixing pan. Next, you want to mix together all your wet ingredients. So in a separate bowl, whisk together your buttermilk or milk with vinegar, oil, eggs, vanilla, and stir in your melted chocolate once everything is whisked in. As for melting your chocolate, you're either gonna want to melt it slowly in the microwave, slowly adding a bit of milk or cream to make it pourable, or you can melt it using the double boil method. Add your wet ingredients to your dry ingredients, mixing them slowly with a whisk, and when everything is mixed in, mix in your hot coffee last. Make sure not to do this too hard because you will beat out the air and make it quite flat and dense. Pour your batter into your baking pan or pans and bake it for 30 to 40 minutes depending on the size of your pan. When your cakes are nearly finished baking, I would start making the frosting. Get your cream, put it into a stove and heat it until it steams, just before boiling but not quite. Pour this cream into the chopped hot chocolate and let it sit for about 2 minutes. Then, using a whisk, beat in the butter and salt and add in the powdered sugar until the taste and consistency of your liking. Once your cakes are finished baking and you've got your frosting, all that's left to do is to assemble it. Now this is where things can get a bit tricky if you didn't use 2 circular pans. If you did, now you can just frost one layer, put another on top, and call it a day, and then frost the whole thing, and you'll be fine. But if you didn't, you're gonna have to kind of do this thing that I did where you flop your cake onto a chopping board, you cut it in half, you put half of the cake onto a plate that you're gonna serve it on, then you frost that cake top side up, and then you put the other cake onto another plate to make sure it doesn't break when you move it on top of the other one. You slide it on, and then you kind of have to cut it into the shape that you want it because it's not circular. If you weren't that bothered, you could just cut it into a square, and that would be a lot easier than trying to make it a perfect circle. But if you wanted to make it look like the Matilda chocolate cake, it has to be a circle. So what I did is I got a serrated knife and I just kind of kept chopping around the edges until it became a circle. And don't worry if you have scraps and bits left over, just put them in a bag, squeeze them together, crumple them together a bit, then form them together with your hands into a ball, put them in the freezer, and then you have cake pops which can be saved for later and never go out of date, so keep those in your freezer for a later date. At one point, I'm not gonna lie, it started looking very, very bad, and I started thinking, oh my god, am I gonna have to throw this away, or I'm gonna have to do this again? But then I just kind of remembered, like, you know, the chocolate cake from Matilda is messy, and it's grotesque, and that's the whole point, right? So I just went with it and decided to try and have a bit of fun, and it actually turned out alright, you know. I just kept cutting and adding frosting and adding little bits of chopped cake where it kind of kept breaking apart a little bit. I made sure to put all the frosting around. It came out really, really nice. Before I show you the final results, however, I do want to have a little talk about Matilda. I want to talk about the history and a little bit about chocolate cake in general. So before we dig into our lovely homemade cake, let's have a little talk about that. Matilda, published in 1988, a classic Roald Dahl story where a young girl, Matilda, overcomes cruel adults, her parents and Miss Trunchbull. His stories are often written with a sense of dark humour and exaggerated villains, like Miss Trunchbull. This might be because Dahl went to boarding school growing up, and boarding schools are infamous for their distant teachers and harsh discipline. You can often see in his works the villains or antagonists are often cruel authority figures, much like boarding school teachers, principals, or even parents. Interestingly, Dahl actually quite often uses food in his works. It's used to represent excess, temptation, or even resilience. If you think about some of his other works, such as Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or James and the Giant Peach, food plays a major role in both of those works. And of course there's Matilda, where Miss Trunchbull tries to use the chocolate cake to humiliate and embarrass Bruce Bogtrotter, but he ends up eating the whole cake and he turns it into this act of resilience and defiance. And he wins over the whole crowd, and it's this really big moment. This act, it flips the power dynamic, and it shows that children can outlast oppressive authority. The cake isn't only used as a symbol of gluttony and indulgence, but also resilience and rebellion. Chocolate cake became wildly popular in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Because chocolate became cheaper and more available. This didn't mean that it was cheap and very available, it just meant that, people could get their hands on it for special occasions and stuff like that, and it was very much tied to luxury and indulgence. By the time Matilda was published, decadent chocolate cakes kind of became cultural icons, and they were kind of used as shorthand in media for the ultimate indulgence. Dahl himself actually loved rich, over-the-top foods and actually published his own recipe book called Roald Dahl's Revolting Recipes, which later featured whimsical versions of food from his own books. And I didn't get this recipe directly from that book today, but I will definitely be making recipes from that book in the future. I think that'll make a very interesting video. The film adaptation, released in 1996, directed by the man, the myth, the legend, the GOAT, Danny DeVito, cemented the image of Bruce Bogtrotter covered in chocolate cake in pop culture, both grossing out and inspiring the children that watched it. Marking it as an absolute cinematic classic. I honestly believe if it wasn't for that film, so many people wouldn't remember it for what it was. And the book was great, but the film popularized it. I really do believe that. When making this cake, I wanted to replicate the decadent, over-the-top nature of it, and which is why it was really important to use butter, sugar, cocoa, and most importantly, melted chocolate in the batter. Because this cake being decadent, over the top, and rich and indulgent and almost disgusting, it's storytelling. It's such an important part of the book and the movie, and I just don't think I would be doing it justice if I didn't make it like that. And now, for the cake.
Her sweat and blood went into this cake.
You wanted cake, you got cake. Now eat it!
Honestly, it tasted amazing. I'm no baker, but I've made a few cakes before in the past, and this was, without a doubt, 100% the best cake I've ever made ever. It was so good. Everyone I gave it to couldn't believe how good it was. It was so rich, it was so decadent, it was so chocolatey, but it wasn't too sweet because it was made out of dark cocoa, and it had a balance because it had coffee in it. Honestly, it was so good. I made it yesterday because it took a long time to film the whole process, and I already had some, but I will eat some more again because I'm not going to say no to eating more of the cake because it was amazing. Honestly, one of the best things I've ever made, one of the best tasting cakes I've ever had. I would have been happy if I bought it at a store. I was so happy with it. I would definitely recommend making it at home. Like the camera, honestly, the camera doesn't even do it justice, man. Like, it's not gonna focus. The camera doesn't even do it justice. Like, it tastes so good. do yourself a favour, go and try and make it. Again, these foods that I am making, I'm making from scratch for the first time, and this turned out so nicely that you would think that I've made it before. If you really wanted to go for that film/book look, replicate the original, I would use circular pans to make it look nicer and more uniform, and then I would also use a bit more frosting to make it look a bit more, gluttonous, you know, a bit more indulgent, because the amount of frosting I used was it went a little bit thin, but in terms of actual taste, I would recommend about the ratios that I used. And that's it for today's video. Very happy with how this video turned out. I'm very happy with the final result. Even though it looked a bit ugly, it tasted amazing, so I think that's what's more important at the end of the day, really, when you're eating food, right? I'm gonna go and try to not finish the entirety of this cake by myself and put on 10 kilograms. But stay tuned, because next week I'm gonna be making Olden's Olden from One Piece, which was very kindly suggested to me by Rang Pariya Priyanshu. I'll write the name up on the screen somewhere. I hope I didn't butcher your name. Thank you for the suggestion, and see you next week.
Her sweat and blood went into this cake.